Taking a trip to be with my Savior. I'm taking a trip to be.
Welcome to you all. We have just entered into Howard Finster's brain, and I'm going to be your guide as we walk through the divine clutter of this incredible artist, preacher, tinker, shaman's inner gray matter. We're going to get an insight into what really made Howard Finster tick, which is no easy matter because, as we will see as we walk through this room, this is not just a complex man, but someone who indeed was from another planet. So it's no easy matter to get a feeling for what really was going on inside his mind. It was an extraterrestrial mind. So let's start at the beginning in terms of Howard's presence on Earth, and probably the best thing to do is to observe the head of Howard here, a head that Howard himself produced for us, and it's indicative of the spirit of this room and the spirit of the man. Most people have a sense that part of the power of Howard's work is the juxtaposition of word and image. Words are everywhere. Words are around us in this room. I simply want to draw your attention to one thing. We see that in this image here of his head, and we also have a wonderful quotation from Howard, and he refers to himself as having a computerized brain. It was compartmentalized. In the image here, we see various small doors that he could open at will and could enter into different spaces, which allowed him to do the myriad things that he was capable of. So let's dwell on that image and then dwell, as I say, on the chronology of Howard Finster as his life unfolds. A poor person from a large family in northern Alabama, a small town, Valley Head, Alabama, and trace the steps of his emergence as, I think many would agree, the greatest of the so-called self-taught vernacular outsider artists of the 20th century. If we do that, we first have to encounter the mystery, the mythology of Howard Finster. That is, we have a problem at the very outset in terms of exactly when he was born. And there is, in fact, a debate currently as to which is the more accurate date, whether it's 1915 or 1916. I'm not going to go into the details on that, simply to say that we have decided to agree with the family's position on this, that it was 1916. For those that would like some more of the esoteric lore having to do with this mystery, we invite you to enter into the brain on your own. Let's take the trip now with Howard as he starts to develop as a preacher, as a born-again evangelical Christian, as a hard-working young boy. His father was someone who both had a farm and also worked in a lumber mill. Howard was always hardworking, was always possessed with a boundless curiosity. He was a tinkerer, he was a jack of all trades, and he was always experimenting with materials and things and ideas. He was a dreamer, and indeed, I think the theme of the show that we've been playing around with here in this video, that we are able to fly to these various islands of meaning that we associate with Howard. Flight is a theme that is very much a shamanistic theme. Howard, in fact, tells us that when he was young, he often dreamt that he was flying, and he describes quite eloquently the various flights that he would take out into the sky above the poverty that he was surrounded with, but he could dream of wondrous things, he could dream of other worlds. And all of that came to a significant point in his early life. Indeed, when, as he tells the story, he was only 3 years old, and he was out looking for his mother in the tomato patch, and he was calling for his mother and started to cry because he didn't know where she was. And he looked around and he started to look up, and suddenly he saw something. And as he describes it, or as he described it later, this was his first vision. He saw his sister descending on a stairway from the heavens and beckoning to him. And of course, the significance of this is that the sister that he saw, Abby, was someone that had died previously, in fact, had died of complications from rabies. And this was a very poignant moment, both in the memories he had of his sister, but also the realization that this was a sign of something greater in terms of his own destiny. And in fact, he says that when he looked back and reflected on the meaning of that event, he realized that indeed was a true sign from God that he was going to become a visionary artist. So this becomes a significant moment in his early life. Now, there are many things to talk about here, but let's simply refer to another key period in his early life. And that was, of course, if you are a Southern Baptist from a rural area, from a relatively poor background, the role that religion plays, especially that very intense form of religion that is characteristic of Southern Protestant tradition, plays a central role in people's lives. It certainly did in Howard Finster's life. And of course, the key event in that is not simply to say that you're a Christian, not simply to say that you believe certain things or that you go to church. It is, in fact, to be born again, to have an extraordinary experience of self-transformation and relationship with visitors from other planets, let us say, because, of course, Jesus, in a sense, was a visitor from another planet as well. And Howard tells us that, I think it's correct to say around the age of 12, that he has his first conscious experience of being born again. This, again, is a turning point in his life. He has a sense of destiny in terms of the fact that he is a conduit for something greater than he is individually, a conduit, in this case, for the Word of God, as communicated through the Bible. And he doesn't achieve this right away, but certainly the notion that he would become a preacher of God's Word becomes a significant factor for him. And his early life, in many ways, revolves around that theme. Never just that, however, because, as we said at the very beginning of his life, Howard was someone who was boundlessly curious about the world about him, and boundlessly curious about what can be done with the material aspects of the world. And we see one of his early clocks. He was experimenting with wood-burning techniques, toys that he made, and so on. All of this flows into, again, another dramatic period in his early life. And he decides one day that he needs to build a garden, or what he called at that time the Plant Farm Museum. Now, you will see, or you have seen, a very famous image, an iconic image, which is the Plant Farm Museum sign that he made to put in that first outdoor environment, and tells, again, the story of what he was doing. We're now in the late 60s. He's doing various things to make his living for himself and his family. And one of the things that he's doing is that he has a sense of helping the community and the children in the community. And now we've moved into the 70s. He's repairing bicycles, broken down bicycles for the community children, and repairing them. And now we have reached that mythic moment, the key event in terms of the story that he tells about his epiphany as an artist. That is in 1976. Usually it is said in January of 1976. And I'm going to recount the story that he most often tells, because there are variations on this, both that he told and then as they were translated by others. But the most common story is simply this, that he was getting ready to repair a bicycle, and he was testing out the paint he was going to use, and as he liked to say, he used whatever thrown away enamel paint was handy, and he had some white paint. And he dipped his finger in the white paint, and as he was going to test it on the frame, he brought his hand up, and a small face appeared in the paint in the tip of his finger. And Howard clearly was somewhat astounded by this, because not only did a small face appear, it winked at him, and it said, "Howard, this is God. I want you to paint sacred art." Howard, as again he tells the story, was indeed somewhat dumbfounded by this. He hadn't claimed before to speak regularly to God, although here we are speaking. He responds to God by saying, "God, you know, I always try to do what you want me to do, but you know, I've never done this, and I don't know if I can." And God looks at him, winks again, this tiny little face in the paint, and says, "Howard, how do you know if you haven't tried?" And again, as Howard says, "Gee, God, I guess you got me. I need to try." And he takes a dollar bill out of his wallet and nails it up on a shed that was there. And he paints his first painting, which, again, as legend would have it, is a picture of George Washington from the dollar bill. Now, again, myths are misshapen things, and they take on all sorts of different lives of their own. One of the wonderful things that we were able to include in Howard's brain here is this whole issue of exactly what it means to say something was the first. Equally interesting is this issue of what this first painting was, because he would say it was George Washington. But as we see here in Howard's brain, there were other images that he produced, each of which at some point he claimed to be his first painting. And it was quite exciting for us as we did our work with collectors. And we see another piece here, which is George Washington, but it's not so much a painting, but a piece of concrete that has been painted. And since he was a little bit nervous at this point as to what he really could claim or not claim, he very carefully indicates that this is the near to first work. And then, of course, someone else must have pointed out that he described it as an actual painting on a board, and this is a concrete piece. And we see there's another piece here. At one point, he had written on it the #1 painting, but then someone said, well, again, it's not George Washington. So we crossed that out, and we have close to Howard's first piece of art. A wonderful vignette on myth-making, if there ever was one. What is so impressive and amazing about Finster is the degree of passion and energy and compulsion or obsession, as many would put it, that emerges full-blown at this moment. There's an eruption of psychic, artistic, spiritual energy. Some would say, if you needed to draw a comparison, that there is a kind of latter-day shamanistic power that is manifesting through his work, through the very cells of his body. He goes into this obsessive state of producing art objects. He sleeps very little. He is in a kind of constant state of agitation and excitement about this new way to do God's work, a way that he realizes has a power that was missing when he was simply the preacher of words, that when he adds images to the words, there's a new degree of power and influence and significance that he's able to communicate.
Taking a trip to be with my friend. I'm taking a trip just to be with my Jesus. I'm taking a trip just to be up home. I'm taking a trip just to be